Today the subject is the United States, or the United States as the context for the definition of a contemporary progressive alternative. And next week it will be Europe, the European Union especially, which is the historical home ground of the default position of the progressives today in the world, which is institutionally conservative social democracy, or its liberalized and eviscerated form, social liberalism. Now, in order to explore the outline of a potential alternative in both the American and the European context, I have to make arguments that are very schematic, alluding only in the briefest terms to the main domains of institutional change. But I will return later in the course in much greater detail to the themes that are evoked in this American and European discussion. The democratization of the market order, the deepening of democracy, and the transformation of education and of consciousness. The spirit in which I engage this American and European discussion is not the dominant spirit today. It's not the idea characteristic of the contemporary progressives that there is a universal orthodoxy, neoliberalism or social liberalism, and then there are national heresies, a Chinese way, a Brazilian way, and so forth. Each of these heresies compose of a combination of elements of the universal orthodoxy with unique national deviations. I rather prefer to look at the situation as a world chain of analogies. I believe, as Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill believed, in a world politics, and that a universal orthodoxy cannot be successfully combated by a series of local heresies. A universal orthodoxy can be effectively combated only by a universalizing heresy, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century. And that, therefore, is the spirit in which I engage the American and the European discussion. In this discussion, I'm going to distinguish three steps or stages of my argument. The first is to make some brief historical remarks about how the contemporary debate about the progressive alternative emerges out of American history. In the second step, then, the outline of a programmatic alternative. Described, as I said last week in the first class, at an intermediate point of distance from the present. Not either very close to what now exists or very far away. Because this intermediate distance is, I argued then, most convenient to the interests of conceptual clarification, as opposed to what we prefer in the discourse of transformation or the practice of transformation, which is to combine the very close to the very far away, the practical and the prophetic. And all the countries of the world are connected by a chain of analogies. analogous problems and analogous solutions. There is a very limited stock of live options for the organization of different parts of social life in the world. And this limited repertoire of solutions is, as it were, the fate of the contemporary society. So to enlarge that fate or to rebel against it, we have to remake this repertoire and expand it. Now, I start with the following observation about American history. There is a narrative of about American history that says the central problem of American history was slavery and its consequences, black and white. In the 19th century, there were two different economies in the United States. The slave economy in the South, and in the North, an economy of small-scale proprietors, artisans, and tradespeople, with only a very small, nascent plutocratic elite at the top. Slavery was defeated, the South was defeated in the Civil War, but the consequences of slavery remain, according to this narrative. And the central issue in the United States remains reckoning with its consequences, the unfinished business of the destruction of slavery through the overcoming of its consequences. But there's a second narrative, and the second narrative is, to my mind, more important. It's true that there is this unfinished business, but the main problem is that the other United States, the United States that existed in the North, the economy of the small-scale proprietors and traders, was also destroyed in the sequel of the Civil War and undone by what came later, mass immigration, industrialization, Fordist mass production industry, and massive concentration of economic power. So there's another narrative, which is the destiny, the fate of this other country. What happened to it, or what could it become? And the premise, the historical premise from which I'm proceeding, is that it's this second narrative which should be the main focus of attention, although the first narrative retains significance. Now let me focus then on just two moments of American history. The early republic, in the period between independence and the Civil War, and the New Deal. So I briefly addressed the question of the early republic last week in the first class. And remember, I made the following claim. To understand the construction of the United States, what the United States became, it's necessary to take into account two different projects. One project that came from the top down, and the other project that came, as it were, from the bottom up. The project that came from the top down was a developmentalist nationalism, or a national developmentalism. It was Hamilton's project. It was the project of literally opening up the United States, building it through massive mobilization of resources, at the center of which there was a clique of entrepreneurs, politicians, bureaucrats, who literally built the country through this forced mobilization of resources, which included, of course, the development of the basic transport network, roads, canals, and later railroads. The National Bank was used as the financial device for the funding of this national project. The economy developed under very high protectionist barriers well until the 1920s. The United States was one of the most protectionist economies in the world. And this was the object of the construction. But the United States would not have become what it became if this developmentalist project had not interacted with something else. And the something else was the selective democratization of the market order in what were then the two crucial sectors of production. Since after all, this was a pre-industrial economy: agriculture and finance. And I suggested last week how in agriculture, the Americans resisted what was supposed to be the inevitable economic evolution of agrarian concentration, such as had occurred in England. They distributed the lands under the Homestead Act. The Homestead Acts were promulgated on the same day on which Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And under the Homestead Acts, the land was distributed widely to small-scale proprietors. They then proceeded to organize the institutional basis of family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics. They brought agricultural science to the door of the family farmer on the basis of the agricultural science developed in the land-grant colleges to a system of agricultural extension. The government sent emissaries, national and local government, to the local farmer and established a connection to the local producer. And they secured family-scale farming against its unique combination of price volatility and climate volatility, economic risk and physical risk, which then required the development of a whole range of devices to serve as the antidotes to this dangerous combination. Food stockpiles, price supports, crop insurance, agricultural income insurance, and so forth. So there was a strategic coordination, we would say in today's vocabulary, between the government and the local producer. And among the producers, the government encouraged cooperative competition. They were independent proprietors, but they pooled resources, technical resources, financial resources, and labor to achieve economies of scale. And the result of this combination of the developmentalism above and the selective democratization below was to produce what became the most efficient system of family-scale agriculture that ever existed up to that point. The most efficient or productive agriculture, period, in the whole world. And then last week I suggested how in finance they did something similar. There was a conflict over the National Bank, which was the instrument of that incipient, that nascent plutocracy. And under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, this conflict came to a head, and there was a decision to abolish the second bank of the United States, the Second National Bank. And for over 100 years, any bank was forbidden in the United States from operating in more than one state of the Union. Until at the end of the 19th century, the New York banks, even before this prohibition was lifted, become de facto national banks. So the Americans developed the most decentralized system of credit at the service of the local producer that had ever existed in the world. And so the claim I made was that when the Americans did this in agriculture and in finance, they were not regulating the agricultural or the financial market. And they were not generating a series of devices of corrective redistribution to moderate the inequalities generated in the market. They were doing a third thing, which is much more important than either regulation or compensatory redistribution. They were reinventing the legal and institutional architecture of the market order in those sectors of agriculture and finance. And that's much more important. And that's what I'm calling the selective democratization. Now, this virtuous dialectic between nationalist developmentalism and selective sector-specific democratization was progressively weakened later on in American history. And we can ask, why was it weakened? And a suggestion might be that it was weakened for two main reasons. One, political, and the other conceptual or ideological. The political reason is that the Americans had organized under their Constitution what was in effect a proto-democratic liberalism rather than a democracy or a high-energy democracy. A democracy that inhibited popular influence or popular engagement in political life and left power, for the most part, in the hands of a cadre of notables. At the beginning, there were property and education qualifications of the suffrage. But even when those constraints on the suffrage were cast aside, the Republic retained this character, this elitist character. So this was, like all the democracies that exist in the world, but in a way which is even clearer than what happened in most of Western Europe. A weak democracy. Weak in the sense that it was not designed in its constitutional arrangements to facilitate the repeated practice of structural reform, to weaken the dependence of change on crisis. That is, the rule in all of these flawed democracies throughout the world is that if there's no crisis, there's no change. Crisis in the form of war or economic ruin was the enabling circumstance of transformation. And therefore, as a result, the perpetuation of the rule of the living by the dead. Jefferson had suggested that every 2.5 generations, the Constitution of the United States be thrown out and a new Constitution be made so that the dead would not rule the living. But of course, this idea did not become prevalent in the United States. The Americans came to revere their Constitution, and the cult of the Constitution is one of the salient characteristics of the way that Americans think about politics. And the conceptual weakness was that at no point in the development of their ideas about society and about law did the Americans make explicit the idea that I stated a moment ago, that this reinvention of the market order in the agricultural and financial sectors was simply an instance of a general idea. The general idea is that the market order has no natural and necessary form, and it can be reinvented. They reinvented it without developing the doctrine of its possible reinvention. And it took then 150 years in the development of American legal thought for them to discover that the market order has no single natural and necessary form. That was the greatest analytic achievement of legal thought from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th. And to this day, it has not penetrated the inner sanctum of practical economics. So these two forces working together, the weakness of democracy and the weakness of thought, the institutional superstition or dogmatism about the market order, prevented that virtuous dialectic from being invented or reinvented in new forms later in American history. And so there was then a space open for the ascent of the marriage between corporate power and high finance under the watchful eyes of a pliant state. Compromising the possibility of giving new life and new meaning to that vision of the early republic, of an economy, an economic order, of small-scale proprietors and artisans. Small scale was incompatible with the accumulation of resources at scale required by a modern complex economy. So there would have to have been some reinvention of the logic of access to decentralized resources and opportunities, the property right, alternative property regimes, alternative ways of reconciling the aggregation of resources at scale with economic decentralization. Now let me take a second moment in American history, which is the moment of the New Deal and of the war economy. So the tendency in the United States is to sentimentalize the New Deal, to look back for it wistfully as the example to follow. And it's necessary to have a realistic and unsentimental view of what the New Deal accomplished and did not accomplish to understand the problem today. So You could take the long New Deal from Roosevelt's coming to power to the aftermath of his death after the Second World War and distinguish 4 stages in the evolution of the New Deal. So the first was the early stage of radical institutional experimentalism. 1932 and the first 6 months of 1933. And what was the content of this experimentalism? It was not the radical democratization of the market order. It was the restabilization of the American economy. It was concerted action between government and business to manage competition, to limit it, typically through cartels supervised by the government, and to stabilize it, to restabilize it, combined with the direct hiring of workers, labor fronts, by the government. The content was the same content. It was adapted widely in Europe, including by the right-wing regimes. So the economic policies of the early Roosevelt administration were very close to the economic policies of the early years of the Hitler regime. A fact, of course, which no one in the United States would like to remark. But the politicians are always at the mercy of the available ideas. Roosevelt was a genuine experimentalist. He wanted to try everything out. But you can call the spirits, but will they come? So it wasn't just his disposition that would be enough. Those were the ideas that prevailed in the 1930s. This concerted action, this managed competition, this corporatism. Then there was a second stage of the New Deal. From the middle of 1933 to the war, in which the focus narrowed to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, to prevent bank runs through the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated proprietary trading from federally insured deposits, and above all, the Social Security Act, which then provided a guarantee, a social guarantee of pensions for the whole working population. So the focus on this corporatist restabilization narrows to the provision of economic insecurity. And then comes the third moment, which is the war economy, a remarkable episode. Because in the war economy, the Americans cast off their supposed economic dogmas, their ideas about the market economy, and ran the economy on a completely different basis, of flexible coordination between government and business, which produced spectacular results. An attempt was made by the progressives to bring small business into the picture. For the most part, it failed. That was the Small War Plans Act. And the essence of the war economy was the combination of massive resource mobilization with institutional experimentalism. The institutional experimentalism was this flexible, undefined coordination between big business and the government. And the resource mobilization had the following quantitative consequence. The total volume or value of war procurements in the first 6 months of 1943 was greater than the total GDP of the United States in 1942. So it's massive. The top rate of the progressive personal income tax at one point exceeded 90%, which is unimaginable to Americans who are alive today. And the results were spectacular. In 4 years, GDP in the United States doubled. There had never been such a sensational economic outcome. And then at the end of the war, after Roosevelt's death, came the focus on demand-led economic growth, on consumption, on mass consumption. So the agenda of institutional experimentalism of the early New Deal was over, it was abandoned, its focus had narrowed. And the institutional experiments of the war economy were judged as largely irrelevant to the organization and practice of the peacetime economy. The basis was consumption. Mass consumption made possible in part by the democratization of credit. While Franklin Roosevelt was still alive, he was asked once what book he would like to see in the hands of every Soviet child. And they thought he would say the Holy Bible. But he said the Sears Roebuck catalog. And this was then the formula of economic growth in the United States. Now, is all of that experience of the New Deal a model for what's necessary today? Today, there's an insular knowledge economy, a vanguard which is reduced to a series of fringes. This fringe-like character of the productive vanguard is a basis for economic stagnation and for the aggravation of inequality, anchored in the structural divisions between the vanguard and everything else. So something else is needed. A radical democratization of economic opportunity, and not the restabilization of the economy or simply the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity. It's a different problem. Now, I don't want to pursue the historical discussion because the objective is simply to show how the programmatic task emerges out of the historical experience. And in a way, it seems to me that the experience of the early republic, that dialectic between developmentalism and selective democratization, is more pertinent to the problems of today than the example of the New Deal. But let me stop there. I don't want to say anything more historically, and ask for any comments about this historical account. Well, now I'm going to proceed, as I said, very schematically, but all the content is going to come back later in the substantive themes. So let me distinguish 4 great areas of national reconstruction. The democratization of the market is the first thing, and the most important thing, the most obvious concern of a progressive project. The second is the deepening of democracy. third is the organization of civil society, outside the market and outside the state. The institutional basis of social cohesion. And the third is education and the fourth is education and consciousness. Now, with respect to the democratization of the market order, there are three great substantive themes. The first is the relation of the vanguard of production, the advanced part of production, to the rest of the production system. The second is the relation between labor and capital. And the third is the relation between finance and production, or finance and the real economy. So first, the vanguard and the rest. Conventional industry, so-called Fordist industrial mass production, has ceased to be the vanguard. It is in decline in the United States and all over the world. Those are the Rust Belt industries, so-called, in the United States. And it survives either as a vestige of an earlier vanguard or as a satellite to the new vanguard. The new vanguard is the vanguard of the knowledge economy. Now, the knowledge economy should not be identified narrowly with advanced manufacture, and much less, even more narrowly, with the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. The knowledge economy exists in every part of the production system, in intellectually dense services, and in precision or scientific agriculture, as well as in advanced manufacture. But in every part of production, the knowledge economy exists as an island, as a fringe, excluding the vast majority of workers and of firms. And this insular character of the knowledge economy then becomes a source of economic slowdown on one side, because the most productive practice is denied to the majority of the labor force and of the businesses, and of the aggravation of inequality on the other hand. Inequality is anchored in this abyss between the advanced part of production and the rest, the rear guard, the vanguard and the rear guard. The traditional devices for attenuating inequality by corrective redistribution, progressive taxation, and redistributive social spending are powerless to redress the massive inequalities that result from these structural divisions. The corrective redistribution would have to be massive. And long before it reached the requisite dimension to annul the inequalities, it would begin to disorganize the economy, to undermine the basis for the established arrangements and incentives to save, invest, and employ. So what would be necessary then would be to have a plan to transform this knowledge economy for the few that exists into a knowledge economy for the many. To replace the exclusive vanguardism by an inclusive vanguardism. And you could imagine, speculatively, a transformation going through stages. The initial stages could be quite modest. The ultimate stages would be very radical. But The initial stages would be a 21st century equivalent to the 19th century agricultural extension that I just invoked. Yes. The addressees of the effort at uplift of the rear guard would be the relatively backward small and medium-sized firms of the production system, and the increasing mass of autonomous workers, workers who have no stable connection to a large business organization, and are often in situations of precarious employment. So the insular knowledge economy has as one of its corollaries the consignment of a large part of labor to radical economic insecurity, especially in the form or as the consequence of precarious employment. So it's not just credit or capital that would have to be made available, but capabilities, practices, technologies would have to be reinvented or repackaged so that they be accessible and assimilable by the relatively backward economic agents. In this analog to the 19th century agricultural extension that produced the family-scale farming with the entrepreneurial attributes. Then you can imagine a second stage in which, out of this, effort at decentralized partnership, a form of strategic coordination between government and business for the purpose of the uplift, there would begin to emerge a new architecture of the market. Between the government and the firms, a form of partnership or strategic coordination that would be pluralistic, decentralized, participatory, and experimental. And among the firms, as in the agricultural example of the 19th century, cooperative competition, as they would be independent, but they would also pool certain resources and through this pooling achieve economies of scale. And then you could imagine far into the future the thought experiment that I alluded to in the first class. You should say, the market order will cease to be pinned to a single dogmatic version of itself. Different regimes of private property or social property and contract will coexist experimentally in the same market order. So, for example, some of the productive resources of society, liquid capital and technology, will be vested in funds, not in the government, that would then, with powers for discretionary allocation of these funds, but in funds, and these funds would conduct a kind of rotating capital auction. They would auction off the productive resources of society to the groups of workers or entrepreneurs or technicians who could ensure the funds of the highest rate of return. And you can imagine that there would be different regimes, different models, different time horizons, different risk profiles. And so we would observe the results, and the democratic institutions would then say, we'll increase the room for that type and diminish the room for the other type. So we would take seriously the idea that the market order has no single natural and necessary form, and we would organize it to create this decentralization of resources. Now, what stands in the back of this exercise is a dilemma, the new dilemma of development or growth in the world. And it can be summarized in the following way. Up to the end of the 19th century, the teaching of development economics is that there was a shortcut to economic growth. The shortcut was conventional industry. You take resources and workers out of the relatively less productive sector, meaning in practice agriculture, and you put it in the more productive sector, meaning industry. Now that shortcut has stopped working in the whole world. So you could say the Rust Belt industries are not coming back. Nothing will bring them back to life. You can prolong their life for a few years through protectionism, through restraints on plant closing, through subsidies and so forth, but they're not coming back as the lifeline of economic growth. What is the alternative? The alternative would be a socially inclusive form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy. But the socially inclusive form of the knowledge economy doesn't exist. The only form that exists is the insular and exclusive form. So the claim is that this dilemma can only be broken on the second side. The only possible solution to this dilemma is finding a way to make that exclusive knowledge economy relatively more inclusive, given that there's no way to revive conventional industry as the vanguard. Conventional industry survives either only as the vestige of an earlier vanguard or as the satellite to the new vanguard. So the masters of the vanguard now have discovered a way to bifurcate the process of production. Part of the process of production they commoditize or routinize, and that part they then subcontract to workers in firms in remote parts of the world. Labor and tax arbitrage, with a lower tax taken a lower wage. And the lucrative and creative part they keep for themselves. So what happens is that instead of a economy-wide dissemination of the new vanguardism, the opposite happens. A retreat to a more and more contained island within the larger system. And that's the vicious process that would have to be counteracted through a plan like the one summarized in this description that I just gave. Now, it's not that we would have the capital auction as the only form of economic decentralization. We would say the unified property right, absolute property, as I suggested in the first class, would continue to be one of the forms of economic decentralization. It has the advantage that I described before. It allows someone, the owner, the absolute owner, to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in, without having to negotiate with a series of stakeholders the lifting of vetoes. But we wouldn't want that to be the only mechanism of economic decentralization. We would want it to be just one among many. Now then we come to the second problem, the relation between labor and capital. So remember, in the 19th century, the general belief among liberals and socialists was that economically necessitated wage labor is an inferior form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of slavery and serfdom. So you can find this idea, for example, in Lincoln's address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society before the Civil War. And that the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, would be the future of free work. But the liberals and socialists were never able to show how the prevalence of self-employment and cooperation as the superior forms of free work could be reconciled with the practical requirements of economic concentration, of aggregation of resources and scale. That would have required the reinvention of property. So now in the United States, as in economies throughout the world, only a minority of the labor force is organized. Unionization shrinks. Only a tiny part of the labor force is unionized. So we can distinguish between the organized and the unorganized parts of the labor force. What's the solution for the organized parts of the labor force? What form of unionization would be best? Probably the form that would be best is the form that is no longer possible to enact. It's a ship that has already sailed. There are two main forms of of union organization in the world. There's the collective bargaining system in the North Atlantic countries, including the United States, which is by analogy to private contract. The premise is, the problem is that in the employment relation, there's radical inequality in bargaining power. To reestablish the equality of bargaining power, you have to organize the workers. It reestablishes the reality of contract in the circumstance of radically unequal bargaining power. But collective bargaining, the contractualist regime, has three great defects. The first defect is that it tends to echo and reinforce the underlying inequalities of the production system. In a very unequal economy, in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, the most advanced firms, the workers, the wage bill is a small part of the cost of production. And the workers have common interests with the owners against everyone else. The tendency of a contractualist bargaining system is to express and reinforce these underlying inequalities, so that the workers in the capital-intensive firms are partners with the owners, and in the other firms, in the backward firms, there's a struggle. Under the contractualist regime, the effort to maintain the union is an endless struggle. And it has to be refought every day. The union has to prove that it can deliver, and that then leads to the third defect. The third defect is that the focus under a contractualist regime naturally becomes just the economistic focus of wages and benefits rather than a broader agenda of institutional change. Now, there's an alternative in the world, the so-called corporatist labor law regime, which the Central and South American countries imitated from fascist Italy. But the nationalist and populist left-leaning regimes gave a social orientation to this alternative. The principle of a corporatist regime is everyone is automatically unionized. But the union is under the tutelage of a Ministry of Labor. It's under the tutelage of the state. So in the contractualist regime, unionization has to be fought for. It has to be decided. It's voluntary, whether the workers unionize or not. And the unions are completely independent of the state. In the corporatist regime, the fact of unionization is a gift of the law. It's automatic, but the unions are under the control of the state. So what might be desirable in principle for the organized part of the labor force is a hybrid regime, which takes from the corporatist regime the principle of automatic and universal unionization, but from the contractualist regime the principle of complete independence of the unions from the state. So different factions or confederations within the union movement fight for position in the unitary union structure, just as different political parties fight for position in the unitary structure of a democratic state. But this seems to be highly improbable. Because this is the mobilization of a 20th century solution to a 21st century problem. And it would require a very difficult and unlikely combination of institutional principles drawn from different sources. And what about the other problem of the disorganized part of the labor force? Today, the majority of workers are disorganized. And a large part of those disorganized are in circumstances of precarious employment. How can there be a logic of inclusive productivity if labor is cheapened and rendered radically insecure? So we could say this disorganized and precarious labor should be organized, if it can be, using the new technologies of communication and information. But to the extent that it can't be, or while it can't be, there should be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. For example, the principle of price neutrality. Precarious labor, labor rendered under conditions of precarious employment, should be remunerated at a level comparable to the level of the similar labor given under conditions of stable employment. This has to do with unionization and the organization of labor, because if we take economies at comparable levels of development, we see that in the world there are wide disparities in the division of national income between labor and capital. And how can we understand these divisions other than by the relative power of labor vis-a-vis capital, shaped by these different legal regimes. Now then we come to the second question, which is technology. Technology always replaces labor. But the question is whether technology can also empower labor. So what is a machine? A machine, everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express or embody in a formula or an algorithm. And then the formula or the algorithm is physically expressed in the machine. The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our time for the not yet repeated. Technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. Technology evolves according to the logic that we give it. And our interest is that it evolve in such a form that it not only replace labor, but also empower labor. And allow us to create a world in which no human being is condemned to do the work that could be done by machines. So the defense of labor and the safeguarding of precarious workers and the redirection or the shaping of the evolution of technology become elements in this agenda, in this part of the agenda of the democratization of the market order. Now we come to the third element. The third element is the relation of finance to production, or finance to the real economy. So you begin with the following enigmas. Under the existing market orders, the production system is largely self-financed. Well over 80% of the finance of production is generated within the production system itself on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. If that's so, what then is the point of all of that money collected in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, it's to finance the productive agenda of society. But the reality seems to be that it has only an oblique and episodic relation to the funding of production. And there are three enigmas. One is this enigma of the superfluity, the uselessness of all of that liquid capital. The second enigma is that in good times, finance seems to be indifferent to the real economy, relatively indifferent. And in bad times, it becomes destructive. It spills over. Financial instability ends up destroying or harming real economic activity. The third enigma is that the financial activity that would seem to be the most important, which is the funding of the creation of the making of new assets in new ways, the unique concern of venture capital and of the similar forms of finance, is a minuscule part of the work of the financial markets. Why is it that the most important activity has the least place? So then, taking the principle that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful, the objective would be to replace the tendency to financial hypertrophy or financialization by the attempt to achieve financial deepening. Finance should be enlisted in the service of the productive agenda of society. The relation between production and finance should be tightened. And you can imagine a series of positive and negative ways in which that would happen. Negatively, by discouraging or prohibiting those forms of financial engineering that make no plausible contribution to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. For example, options contracts, derivatives in financial markets. In agricultural markets, made a strong contribution to liquidity. But in equity markets, although they began as a device to control risk, they were converted into instruments of gambling. The problem is not the speculative element in finance. The problem is the dissociation of the speculative element from production. So I don't want to focus on the details, but I want to present this idea that a democratized political economy, democratized market order, has to address these three great problems. The problem of the relation of the vanguard to the rest has to be lifted up. The distance between the vanguard and the rest has to diminish. That's the first problem. The second problem is labor and capital. For there to be an inclusive vanguardism, labor cannot be cheapened or rendered insecure. Why is a slave economy incompatible with technological advance? Because of that, because labor is cheap and insecure. It's the extreme form. And finance has to serve production rather than being allowed to serve itself. Now, of course, in the discussions that the progressives had in the United States and in much of the world about the democratization of the economy, that's not what they talk about. They don't talk about any of these three things. What they do talk about is corrective redistribution, especially through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. So what is the position with respect to that, which is, after all, the traditional object of discussion? And now I'm going to state three principles in hierarchical order that deal with that. So the first principle is that structural change, shaping the primary or original distribution of economic advantage, always trumps corrective redistribution. The primary distribution, that is, the distribution that results from the established economic arrangements, is always what matters most. The secondary distribution, the distribution that results from the correction of the original distribution by progressive taxation and by redistributive social spending, is always much less important. And why is it much less important? Because it can only be an accessory. Corrective redistribution, if there is a massive inequality, corrective redistribution would also have to be massive. And long before it reached the requisite dimension to correct the inequalities, annul the inequalities, it would begin to disorganize the economy, undermining the established arrangements to save, invest, and employ. And that tension is caught in the familiar rhetorical apparatus of a tension between equity and efficiency. So corrective redistribution can never be the fundamental solution to the problem of inequality. inequality. The fundamental solution always has to come from structural change. But we can't have an unrealistic idea of structural change. Because if we think of structural change in the way that Marxism thinks about it, as the substitution of an indivisible system by another, the binary idea of politics, then it becomes a distant horizon. Real structural change is by its nature fragmentary, but it can nevertheless be cumulative. That's real structural change. And real structural change is always much more important than anything that we can do by way of corrective redistribution. Now I come to the second principle.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can the corrective redistribution be a fragment of the structural change?
Yes. So that's what I'm going to come to right now. So take the European social democracies we're going to discuss next week. Their greatest historical achievement, I'm a critic of the European social democracy, but I recognize that their greatest historical achievement is to have sustained a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities on the basis of a high tax take. So you could say that insofar as corrective redistribution has the consequence of investing in people and their capabilities, it acquires a structural significance. It's not, now, the idea is that the budget matters both on the revenue-raising side and on the spending side. So I'm not saying that corrective redistribution has no role, but its role is secondary to structural change. But with respect to corrective redistribution, what matters? This is the difficult point. On paper, the rich industrial democracy that is most progressive is the United States, which is by far the most unequal of them. Because on paper, the American tax system privileges the progressive taxation of personal income, the progressive personal income tax. The European tax systems are based primarily on the regressive taxation and indirect taxation of consumption through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, or as in the case of France, some functional equivalent to it. And what is this comprehensive flat rate value-added tax? Conceptually, it is a tax which takes a constant proportion of the transformation of every input into an output throughout the economy. And therefore, by definition, it is the most neutral tax with respect to the system of relative prices. So on paper, the American one is the most progressive on the revenue-raising side of the budget. And the economies which are in fact relatively more egalitarian, the European social democracies, base their tax system on the most regressive tax, which is the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. It's regressive because, of course, the poor, the people without, the classes without assets, spend a much greater percentage of what they earn on consumption. So that's why the tax is regressive. Now, what's the explanation of this paradox? The explanation is the following. The European economies are able to tax, to take as tax take, at least 10% of GDP more than the Americans. And why? Because their neutral tax, the VAT, allows them to maximize the tax take, minimizing the economic trauma. That's the magic of this impersonal tax. And so everything they lose by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget, they can gain in double on the spending side. The redistribution occurs on the spending side as a consequence of having a higher tax rate. That's a simple explanation of this apparent paradox. So in the short term, with respect to the budget, if the objective is corrective redistribution, always secondary to structural change, what matters is simply the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. What does not matter relatively is how progressive the tax system is on the revenue-raising side. Now we come to the third principle. Suppose you nevertheless insisted on having a redistributive focus in taxation, and you want to have, for purposes of justice, a redistributive tax system. What are the two main targets of a redistributive tax? The first is the accumulation of economic power, which is very hard to reach through taxation. The part of economic power that is easiest to reach is the accumulation of wealth over a lifetime. And the best way to reach it is at the moment of death through through a confiscatory tax on inheritance or on anticipated inheritance through gifts and survivals. The second target of a redistributive tax is the hierarchy of standards of living. What the individual spends on himself. So economic power and standard of living. Those two together exhaust the whole possible targets of redistribution through tax. And what then is the best way to hit the second target, the target of the hierarchy of standard of living? It's not the income tax, which is the basis of the American tax system. The income tax in the whole world is, in effect, a tax on the salaries of the middle class. Rich people throughout the world do not pay income tax, basically. So the income tax is a hybrid instrument. It doesn't directly and effectively reach either of these targets. It only reaches them obliquely. The economic power or the hierarchy of standards of living. So what would reach the hierarchy of standards of living? The Kaldor tax, the individual tax on consumption. Kaldor was one of Keynes's disciples and was the theoretician of this tax. He wrote a book after the Second World War called The Expenditure Tax, which is the first coherent presentation of the theory of this tax. What is the Kaldor tax? The Kaldor tax takes is a tax on the difference between the total income of the individual, labor income and capital income, and invested saving. So what that difference between total income and invested saving is what the individual spends on himself. It's the basis of the hierarchy of standards of living. And that difference is then what's taxed. And taxed on a steeply progressive slope if one wants to be progressive about corrective redistribution through tax. So you could say, if the individual earns below a certain level, he doesn't pay anything. That's what the Americans call the negative income tax. He receives from the state. Above a certain level, he starts to pay more. And now comes the special characteristic of this tax. At the highest levels of luxury living, the sky's the limit. You could say, for every dollar you spend on yourself, you have to pay $5 to the state. So the top rate is not 100%. The top rate is 500%. So this tax has no technical difficulty different from the income tax. There's no problem. It's a declaratory tax. What you don't demonstrate as invested income counts as if it had been spent and is therefore taxed. There's no administrative problem in this tax. It's strictly a question of political will and political power. So if the progressives were sincere and lucid in their profession of redistributive faith, using the tax system for redistributive purposes, this is the tax they would prefer. But it seems that they don't prefer it. And what happens, certainly in the United States and many other countries, at election time, is that the politicians, the candidates to office, restate their belief in the redistributive tax, the income tax, even though they know that it has a completely marginal effect on real distribution or redistribution. It's just a symbolic way of declaring whose side they're on. That seems to be its purpose. It seems to have a rhetorical purpose. And no one explains to the people this reality. My second principle. So that's what I wanted to say about taxation. So this debate about correct redistribution is almost the whole debate, but it's actually a sideshow compared to the real debate. The real debate is about the structural commitments and arrangements that shape the primary distribution of economic advantage. Now, that's quite a lot already there. Let me stop, and surely someone has some challenge to these propositions or some set of questions. Yes?
So the developmental statement was the approach for development that you say is non-reliable because we cannot really use industry to bring the people that were left behind, and definitely that are at a distance with
Conventional industry.
Yes.
Because there's a new,
Certainly.
because the knowledge economy is also industry.
Right. And in this former approach, it required basically, if we look at Singapore and South Korea as two examples, an authoritarian approach to it. Now we have the same elites that are maybe authoritarian, that are both at the same time this vanguard in the new knowledge economy and dominate the, what you
Yes.
say, the marriage between the corporate industry and high finance.
So who will be the agent, right?
Exactly.
What will be the constituency
Exactly.
of the project?
I'm thinking Citizens United against that ruling here in the United
Of
States.
course.
So
So
how is that structural change, fragmentary in essence, going to give us that?
what is its
Yeah.
constituency? So, first of all, every powerful transformative project helps create its own constituency, right? The constituency is created. Roosevelt created his own constituency and so forth. But here, what I would say is the following, and this is a worldwide phenomenon now that I'm talking about, not a specifically American phenomenon. These structural changes are typically, they don't come into being because someone thinks that normatively they're just a good idea. They're associated with national power, national wealth, national prosperity, and the promotion of the interests of a significant part of the popular majority. So for an alternatives in this direction to come into being, first of all, there has to be a new growth miracle, right? It can't be just that they bring more justice, they sugarcoat. They have to be associated with practical progress. In the agenda politics, the force that commands the agenda is always the force that most credibly represents the cause of creation, of innovation, of energy, of wealth. Not just the humanization or the sugarcoating. It's not just the honey. So there has to be within the elite, there has to be the national elite, a productivist and nationalist counter-elite. In most countries in the world, the dominant part of the elite is composed of rentiers, financially oriented. So there has to be a dissonance within the elite, which a faction of the elite, that's what I'm calling a counter-elite, seizes power in the name of a productivist program. And it then has to garner support in the national majority, the majority of the people. And what about the people? So in most countries of the world, let me postpone the question in the United States. In most countries of the world, most people are poor and disorganized, but their perspective, their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. So what do most men and women in the world want? What they want is a small farm, a shop, a technical service which they can provide for a fee. In other words, they have this petty bourgeois aspiration. They're actually, for the most part, not part of the small business class. So objectively, they're not part of the petty bourgeoisie. But subjectively, they are. So we could call them the subjective petty bourgeoisie. That's the majority of humanity. The majority of humanity now is not Marxist industrial proletariat. The workers in the capital-intensive parts of the production system are a shrinking fraction of the popular majority. And they're seen by the rest of the population and ultimately come to see themselves as just one more special interest. So who speaks for the interests of the whole? Those who speaks for the interests of the whole are these, is this subjective petty bourgeoisie, which is the majority. So for there to be a successful growth miracle that goes in a transformative direction, like the one that I'm foreshadowing in this argument about the United States, the productivist and nationalist counter-elite has to approach the subjective petty bourgeoisie, this popular majority, and offer it an alternative to its default form of aspiration. Because for lack of alternatives, it is wedded to archaic and isolated family business. So it goes nowhere. It's not a solution for the country, and it's not even a solution for these people. So this counter-elite has to approach the popular majority of the subjective petty bourgeoisie and offer them another way of realizing their aspirations. Their aspiration to modest prosperity and independence. And this program that I described earlier of the lift up, the 21st century equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension, is an example of that. So that's how I would begin to answer your question about agency. That's but realistically, it requires this initiative or this alliance of a dissident faction of the national elite with a productivist orientation, and this subjective petty bourgeoisie, which is the majority of the people. Now, what is the counterpart to that in the United States? I ask you. Does that not have a counterpart? What about the white working class majority of the United States. Are they not this, in some way, this subjective petty bourgeoisie? They're not, the majority are not stably employed by a large business organization. They're fragmented, and they're in this situation. So they may not, contrary to the circumstance in developing countries, they're not poor, but neither are they secure. They have no saving. The typical level of family saving in the United States is practically zero. So they have to be involved in this dynamic of inclusive productivity. But what do you think? So the question that's being raised here is the relation between the problem of agency and the content of the transformations. This is very important. This is decisive. Yes.
So going with that, what I see as a problem is that the vanguard of the knowledge economy in this country supports a form of technological determinism. AI is just the latest of the trends. And
Yeah.
because our politics has been limited, constrained, and shaped by that technology in a way that politicians cannot imagine today doing politics without the social media or other tools.
Yeah.
They're also constrained not only by the funding, but by the medium that is in this technological determinism, and the pace in which this is leaving people behind in many ways then cannot be constrained by our politics, nor can they be democratic in any way.
Yes, but the emphasis here is not even on democracy, although that's part of the objective. The emphasis is on productivism. That is, so why the slowdown? So, Solow, who is the most influential growth theorist in the 20th century, late 20th century, said, the computer revolution is everywhere, except in the productivity statistics. So there's productivity slowdown in the United States. There was a brief spike between 1995 and 2004, and that brief spike is often attributed to the one-time benefits of the incorporation of the new information technologies by firms that are themselves not part of the knowledge economy. For example, Walmart. Walmart internalizes the computer technology to manage its stock, its flows, its information. And it has a one-time advance in productivity. But that doesn't result in a process of permanent innovation, which is what the knowledge economy would require. The tendency in the United States is to associate this vanguard, the knowledge economy, not just with advanced manufacture, but with the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. And they are really, in many ways, an exception. They're an anomaly. Because they, first of all, they're largely in businesses that depend and use these network effects, in which the value of the business, not just the value to the owners, but the social value is in the universality of the network. So that's one of the problems with using antitrust as a solution. Because if you destroy the universal network, you destroy the social value, and not just the economic value to the owners. Second, these platform oligopolies are able to pay the costs, the high fixed costs for the incorporation of these technologies. And third, they benefit from the fact that the marginal cost of adding a new user or client to the universal platform is almost zero. Just a button. One more to join the network. The fourth characteristic of these platform oligopolies, which makes them an anomaly, is that they depend on a legal accident. You know, the theory of this stuff is that it's supposed to deal with goods that are so-called non-rivalrous. The consumption of the good doesn't deplete it for other users, but that are legally excludable because you can protect it under law as property. The platform oligopolies have made a business. Their business model depends on an accident of the law. That the law does not give protection or value to the data of individual consumers or clients. So there is a lacuna in the law of intellectual property. And they found a way to make a business, a very profitable business, out of this gap in the law of intellectual property. So that's the platform oligopoly. So in the United States, the knowledge economy is seen through the prism of this anomaly. But the anomaly is an exception to the general character of the knowledge economy. We shouldn't think about it that way. We should think about it according to these other principles. So, but your question about the agent seems to me to be fundamental, because institutional change is an idle exercise unless we're able to associate the plan, the agenda of transformation with an agent. And who is this agent? That's the discussion that we were having. Now, did you understand what I was saying about the discussion concerning corrective redistribution? Corrective redistribution is a sideshow. But the whole discussion is about corrective redistribution. And it's a sideshow, the secrets of which are not understood. I mean, of those three principles I stated, the one that has immediate political effects is the second. But it's not appreciated. Yes?
Sorry, could you just re-explain the European system?
Yes. So it's very important to understand this, because this would change the course of discussion entirely in the United States. So the European social democracies take as tax at least 10% of GDP more than the United States. Now, the aggregate tax take in Europe is at least 10% of GDP higher than it is in the United States. Their investment in social entitlements, in health and education, the high level of social entitlements, is funded by the VAT or some functional equivalent to it. The VAT is this neutral tax which takes a constant proportion of the value of the transformation of every input into an output. Because it is neutral with respect to the price system, it makes it possible to maximize the tax take, minimizing the economic disruption of corrective redistribution. We're having another conversation there, which I said, if the corrective redistribution is maximalist, if it is radical, it begins to undermine the established economic arrangements and incentives. Because it's as if you said, look, the market creates a certain distribution, and then you come after the fact, you're the corrector, and you say, now I'll take it all back. And if you really took it all back and replaced that original distribution by another distribution, you would begin to disorganize the whole economic system. So all it can do is attenuate inequalities. It's an accessory to structural change. It's not a replacement for structural change. And it can have the virtue which the Europeans discovered in it, which is allowing you to invest very heavily in the capabilities of the people, which is not just corrective redistribution, that's productive investment, their health and education. So that's the point that was being made there. So if the Americans say, we want the tax system on the revenue raising side to be progressive, they are in effect preferring progressive pieties to transformative effects. If they were realistic, they would say, the European experience has shown us that progressivity on the revenue raising side doesn't matter. What matters simply is the aggregate tax take and how it's spent. Now, I'm not being absolute about that. I'm saying that's what's true roughly or in the short term. Because if you do want to insist on the redistributive focus, there's a way to do it. That was my discussion of the third principle, the Caldor tax. Did you understand that? Did you follow that?
I think so.
No. Yes.
Yeah, so I take your argument to be that if we invest so much in the inputs of the market, so if we equalize opportunity of everyone, give them knowledge, give them social inheritance, equip everyone to participate in the market,
Yes.
Is your argument that the market law, that first, there is no inherent market logic, so
Yes.
if we change the inputs, the output will not be inequality, is this?
That's right. So in that list, in that hierarchy of the three principles, the key move is the first principle. Structural change trumps corrective redistribution. So everything that you can do to reshape the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity is what matters most. So how is it that you can take a contemporary, complicated economy, which exists, demands huge capital outlays in technology and this and that, and somehow reproduce in it the dynamic of that early 19th century economy of those smallholders who were petty entrepreneurs, achieving modest prosperity and independence, experimenting, masters of their own lives. It can't be done within the restraints of the established property regime. You have to discover a way of connecting economic decentralization with large-scale aggregation of resources. That requires innovation in the property regime. And that's what results in the idea of the capital auction. Now, the capital auction has this strange feature that you could say, well, it's utopian. But a finance theorist would say, actually, it's what we already do. Because the orthodox theory of finance is that a perfectly competitive capital market already is this capital auction that I want. So then you can say, well, then the thought of it's actually not that. We don't really believe that. But let's test whether it's really that by creating this situation. Now, you had a question back there? You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, you mentioned economic trauma.
Economic trauma.
Yeah. Can you
Yes.
say more about that? What do you mean? I think it was in the context of preventing
You
it
mean
in the European.
economic trauma as the result of corrective redistribution?
I don't know, I think you mentioned it in the context of how the European system prevents it or mitigates it, but maybe I got it wrong. My question is, what do you mean by economic trauma in this, in the context of?
What I said is corrective redistribution cannot be massive. Because if corrective redistribution is massive, it will begin to shift the terrain under all of the economic system, the arrangements, the incentives to save, to invest, to employ. It's like I said a moment ago, you'll say, the market produces this distribution, we think it's unjust, so now we'll take it all back. Well, that's not feasible. You can only do that in a modest dimension. So the theories of justice, like the Rawlsian theory of justice, pretend or suppose that you can do that's the solution. You know, they combine institutional conservatism or agnosticism with an egalitarian profession of faith. Now I ask, what's the pragmatic residue of this combination of institutional conservatism with egalitarianism? It's the creation of ideas that serve as a kind of pseudo-philosophical prop to compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. That's what they're for. So there were these institutionally conservative social democracies after the Second World War in the late 20th century, and these Anglo-American theories of justice are the theoretical gloss on that practice, abandoning the horizon of structural change and justifying corrective redistribution. Corrective redistribution can never be the center of any social design. All it can be is accessory. That's the claim. And I think that the idea that corrective redistribution is traumatic, to me, is self-evident. If there are modest inequalities, because the basic distribution, the original distribution, is already relatively egalitarian, then the corrective redistribution can play an accessory role, right? But if there are massive inequalities, like the inequalities that result from this abyss between the vanguard and the rest, the rear guard, the corrective redistribution would have to be massive. And then it's not realistic. It's like saying, we've designed this social system, this kind of market, and now we're going to take it all back. Well, how can that be? So what do you think? Yes.
I don't know if there are others. I'm stuck with approaching the poor unorganized masses.
You're stuck with what?
You said that to overcome these challenges, you have to approach the poor unorganized mass majority, right? That's
Yes.
the condition.
What I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie.
Yes, I cannot say these words.
So,
That's what I mean.
That's right. They're not, that is, in every country in the world, including the United States, the small business class is a minority, right? It's an encircled minority. It always feels itself under threat. In the United States, historically, it has punched above its weight because the small business class is associated with the American ideology, right? The little self-made man, the little entrepreneur, and so forth. But so even in the United States, the small business class is a minority. But the majority of people in the whole world, I'm claiming, have this petty bourgeois horizon.
That I understand. My question is, if there are more examples of how can you approach them successfully when they're not organized?
Well, to organize them. So the going back to the idea of the 21st century equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension, it has two different addressees. So one addressee are the small and medium-sized firms of the economy, typically backward. The majority of those firms in most economies of the world are relatively backward. So how do you develop their capabilities? How do you repackage technologies so that they are assimilable by these firms and so forth? The second advocacy are the individual agents who are not stably connected to a business organization. So the nurse practitioner or the machine repair person, the machine repair technician, who are providing a service, they have to be lifted up also and transformed into what I describe as technologically equipped artisans. But that still retains a connection or an affinity to this 19th century project. Now, I think that that's just, as it were, the first step. That's, you have to approach the backward firms and the backward agents and increase their powers, their capability. Then you have to discover what works. You have to identify what works, and you have to reproduce the successful examples. And that's, I would all bring that under the heading of the experimentalist first stage of this lift-up operation. And then you begin to design an alternative machinery, an alternative architecture, a legal and institutional architecture of the market order, and ultimately a transformation of the property regime. Because then we have to, and that transformation depends on the distinction which I made earlier in an earlier class. If you take the market to the highest level of abstraction, there are at least two dimensions to the idea of the market. One dimension is the absolute amount of decentralization. The number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension is the degree of absolute control that each of those agents has over the